you can please take your seats. Okay. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. My name is Kelly Stone with ActionAid USA, and we are here ready to launch the new report from the CSO Equity Review Group, the 2023 Equity Gap. This is a group of CSOs representing and social movements from faith, from labor, from development to traditional environmental groups who have all been coming together since 2015 to put out a series of reports on a fair share approach to climate action. And perhaps this year is the most important moment since Paris for us to be considering this type of approach, as we are seeing at this COP the first Global Stocktake. It's really a moment for collective consideration of how we got here, what we've learned, but also what we need to do to actually meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. And one thing that has brought this wide-ranging group together is that equity is an absolutely essential ingredient to ambitious climate action. We have a number of speakers today, so I am going to keep my remarks short, but the report that we're launching today really does three things. First, it looks at NDCs, some of which have been updated, and uses our methodology to evaluate what a fair share NDC level of ambition would look like, and compares that to what countries are currently proposing for a select number of countries. We also looked at what the essentially gap in what equitable action would have been since 2015. So looking at what if a country had started in 2015 taking a fair shares approach, how much action that would have required, and what they have actually done since 2015. And then finally, as we are heading into a moment where countries will begin to prepare new NDCs next year for 2035, we also wanted to start a conversation about what real ambition and what a fair share NDC would look like for that going forward. We have a number of speakers today to talk about different aspects of this report and a fair shares approach. So first, I am going to turn it over to Dr. C.C. Holes to talk about the report and methodology.
All right, thanks. Let's do that. So yeah, this is I'm going to talk a little bit about the approach and the results of the report. And one of the things, just to take a little bit of a step back, as Kelly already mentioned, in 2015, just before the Paris COP, a number of groups in civil society came together to look at what were then called the INDCs. So on the left there you see the cover of our first report, and to compare them to what fair shares would be like for countries of the global mitigation effort that's needed, and found that there was, of course, overall lack of ambition, but that lack of ambition is not sort of equally distributed among countries. And so since then we have been doing this pretty much every year except for 2020 for obvious reasons. Yeah, as Kelly mentioned, the GST is interesting because in the negotiations of the GST in Paris and since, there was this idea of parties or collectively that what really should be done is just looking at ambition in an aggregate manner, like the collective progress. And we think that is one of the premises of this work has always been that that's not quite good enough. We have to actually look at individual countries, whether they're doing enough and enough being measured by their fair share. So, and we've been this initiative actually came together to demonstrate that it is doable, that you can actually do an assessment that is based in fair share, that's rooted in science, and that comes to interesting and instructive conclusions. So I've been doing that since 2015. Yeah, and so, yeah, this is like since 2015, over 500 organizations have signed on to these various reports. Here are the covers, and this year we're actually going to release 2 reports, one today and one tomorrow. But now to this one. So when we think about what fair when we assess countries' mitigation targets, which we're talking about in the NDCs mostly, against fair shares, first we need to think about what fair means. And of course, different people can have different views on that, but we are here in the context of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change and the UN, like regimes in general, and there are some pretty good indications what fair means in this context, right? So the Rio Declaration has some words in it, the UNFCCC actually as well, but I come to that a little later. So we're talking about common but differentiated responsibilities, which is in the Rio Declarations, but also the Rio Declaration also recognizes that countries have different technological and financial resources at their command, and that their societies place different amounts of pressure on the global environment. So that has to mean something, right? We also like to to quote Al Gore here, who summarized that for a more general audience quite nicely in 2007, just in the lead up to the Copenhagen negotiations, where he said that countries will be asked to meet different requirements based on their historical share or contribution to the problem. So that's the differentiated responsibility, but also their relative ability to carry the burden of change. And he said, interestingly, that this precedent is well established in international law and there is no other way to do it. And we agree. And so our work in this context has always been built on the equity principle of the UN Framework Convention, and I will not go through all this in detail, but in the UNFCCC we have as a basic principle a precautionary approach to adequacy. Then we have the right to promote sustainable development, and then of course common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. And from all these principles, we determined, or we concluded that the most important indicators of equity, of fairness that come from the convention is adequacy, the need, countries and people's development need, their historical responsibility and their capability, and then we can define quantitative indicators to calculate sort of how much each country's share of these parameters are. And we can maybe, I don't know, if there's enough interest, go into more details in the Q&A, but I'll just leave it at that. The reports give tons of methodological detail that I don't want to burden this audience with right now. And so when we talk about mitigation effort and the fair share, what we're doing for these reports is we look at what is the global mitigation effort that's required, right? So we look at the future emissions projections, then a suitable 1.5 degree scenario, and for these reports we use the low energy demand scenario, which is in the called the IMP-LED in the sixth assessment report, which we like because it does have a very low amount of carbon dioxide removal, and only from natural processes and not from technological fantasies or whatever, and for other reasons. And so in this scenario, the amount of global mitigation required in 2030 is about 35 gigatons of mitigation between where emissions would be headed without mitigation and where they need to be to follow this scenario. And so now we can think about, okay, so that's the global mitigation requirement, and what could countries' fair share of that be? And so based on the principles that I showed in the previous slide, what we are doing is we look at countries' capacity, and which means their financial resources to contribute to addressing the climate crisis, and we look at their responsibility, and then their share of everybody's, like of the global responsibility and capability, is equal to their share of the mitigation that should be required. And so we can come up with these national fair shares of the global mitigation effort. And so we can see that every country has a fair share of the global mitigation effort. For countries that are poor or have and or have large populations of poor people in them, those shares are very small and might in fact not even be visible, but they all have some. And for other countries that have large shares of the global responsibility and capability, those shares are large. So if a country, for example, has a quarter of the global capacity to address climate change and a quarter of the global responsibility to creating the problem, then it seems fair that it would be a quarter of the mitigation required. So that's the general approach. And now what we did, and this now is a chart from this present report that is released. So it shows the updated NDCs to the degree that they have in fact been updated. Not every country has done that. And the horizontal black lines show the NDCs. So in most cases that's just one line, but some countries express their NDCs as ranges, in which case there's two black lines. And then the green bar or band is the fair share. And so it's a band rather than a point, because we are looking at different definitions of what could be considered fair, specifically how much historical responsibility for emissions should be taken into account for responsibility, and on the capacity side we are considering two different metrics of thinking about how much the incomes of the poor should be not considered or considered differently when thinking about a country's capacity. And so that's why we have a range there rather than a single point. And so so the arrows show us how far the NDCs fall short of the fair share range. And so we can clearly see that for the wealthier countries, those are, always like in the double digits or high single digits to double digits of shortfall. And this is the units here for this chart is in tons of mitigation per capita below baseline, so that we need to do that in per capita terms so we can compare countries of vastly different population size. Otherwise it would just be large population would be large shortfall, right? But here we do it on per capita basis. And so we can see in the wealthy countries, the shortfall is in the double digits and high single digits in the case of the European Union. Whereas in the middle income and low income countries, those shortfalls between the NDCs and the fair shares are very small, or in some cases, and those are the green numbers, in some cases the NDCs actually exceed the fair share. So the NDCs are more ambitious than what the fair share of these countries would suggest for the countries with the green numbers. And those are instructive findings, and those are findings that we have consistently been finding since our first review in 2015, despite the updates. So here, because here you can see that the countries to the right are a little bit hard to read, because they are have just a small scale. So this is the same in a different scale, and you can see that, for example, Brazil falls short quite a bit of its fair share as well, but again, so in per capita terms, but not as much as the countries to the left, the high income countries. But yeah, it's still a substantial shortcome. And the findings of the demands of the civil society equity review have always consistently been that all countries have to pledge at least to do their fair share, and then many countries have to do and then have to do more in terms of international support. One thing that we did for the first time this year is, and Kelly alluded to that, is to actually calculate. Sorry, this didn't come out very non-pixelated. Is to calculate the amount of the total shortfall in the between between the fair share and the actual emissions since the year that the Paris Agreement was adopted. And you can see that as that yellow wedge there. And you can see, for example, for the United States, it has been 6.5 gigatons of excess emissions between, like, above its fair share of mitigation since the Paris Agreement. Whereas in India, for example, there's also an excess of emissions, but it's only 400 megatons, even though the country has a much larger population. And yes, and so what these charts also show is what Kelly mentioned, that we now also extended our analysis between 2030. So this is a little bit more difficult to do because we can't really do an NDC assessment for 2035 because no country has put forward an NDC for 2035 yet, so we don't have anything to compare with. But we didn't let that stop us and calculate the fair shares anyway, so that they can just use our numbers and put them into their NDCs to have fair shares pledges. And so those are shown here on these charts, but also are on this table again from the report. And so those are the 2035 mitigation fair shares, and then at the bottom compared to the 2030 fair shares. And we can see that in all countries, the fair shares of mitigation, not surprisingly, in 2035 has to be much higher than in 2030 because we need to mitigate more in 2035 than in 2030. But I don't want to go into these figures more detail. You can all look at them in the report. And just to summarize, what I said in the beginning, we found consistently since 2015, when looking at countries, comparing countries' fair shares and the NDC, that collectively, and we all know that it's so many different studies consistently come to this conclusion that the collective progress is not nearly enough to limit warming to even 2 degrees, right? And so that's a finding that the GST, even with its focus on aggregate progress and collective assessment, can come to. But we can also come to additional conclusions, and that is that while we can do a science and equity-based assessment of individual countries' individual mitigation pledges, and we can come to clear conclusions, namely that all countries have to do more, but that means different things. In the wealthier countries, the more domestic emissions reductions are required. And this is actually something that I didn't talk about yet, so I will do that now. So one thing that you saw, actually go back because I can. One thing that you can see on this slide, for example, is that if you look at the United States, is that the European Union, is that the fair shares line crosses zero sometimes in the 2030s. 2020s, right? So their fair share of the global emission reductions is actually larger than all of their emissions. And so one problem that poses is that is not very easily possible. And so what we've been concluding from that is that wealthy countries whose whose fair share of emission reductions are so large that they can't do it all together, all at home in their own countries, will have to, in addition to their domestic reductions, will have to invest substantially in international cooperation with less wealthy countries to do even more emission reductions there. Because in other countries like China, India, and most countries of the South, the fair share is actually less than the mitigations that should happen in the country, but we cannot fairly or even realistically expect those countries to do these things with their own means. So that would be not fair based on our analysis of fair shares, and it would not be realistic based on the capacity that they actually have. So jumping back to the conclusions, for wealthier countries, that then means that in addition to making deeper cuts at home, they will also have to provide climate finance and engage international support and cooperation, because that is a key part in fulfilling their overall fair share of the effort, because they simply can't do it all at home. And for poorer countries, for less wealthy countries, the low and middle income countries, like we've consistently been saying that every single country has to pledge a mitigation at least equivalent to their fair share, even the poorest. But as I said, the mitigation actually has to happen in these countries, and that's one of the structural injustices of this moment and climate that we are finding ourselves in. The actual mitigation that has to happen there is larger than their fair share. And so we can't get out of this pickle, but we can't expect them to do it on their own, with their own means, at least not fairly. So we have been consistently saying that they have to be ready to do more, but they should be able to expect support and international cooperation to do that. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Cece. Excuse me. And as Cece said, we are going to have a question and answers section at the end, so you will be able to pose questions to all of our panelists then. Now we are actually going to take a moment to enjoy a performance. So I am going to turn it over to our singer, unless Liddy, you want to introduce quickly.
Hello. Just introducing. We call him Waki. He's Joaquin Ignacio. He's one of the youngest member of our delegation, and his mission here is to provide us with music. You know, Filipinos don't do big events without music, so that's one of the things that we wanted to offer to you.
Said I was brought here to play music for you all, and the song I'm going to play is a song by a Filipino songwriter called Noel Cabangon. It's called Power, and it's a very relevant song considering all the things we've discussed with issues considering climate justice and the issues with the planet we live in. And hope you enjoy it. Give me the steady flow of the waterfall.
Thank you so much. With that, I think we've done her a slight disservice in asking her to go next, but I am confident. I want to introduce Shirley Matheson from WWF, who is going to be talking through the Global Stocktake and what it means to be releasing the report in this year.
Thanks, Kelly, and thank you. That was a wonderful performance, and hopefully I can follow it up with some very exciting information about the GST. I wanted to take this space to talk a little bit about the opportunity and challenge that we have this year through the Global Stocktake. I know that it's great to see so many people in the room, and I know that everybody is well aware on the challenges we face and the gaps that we face, and really that's the expectation this year, is that the Global Stocktake can step up and really address that and help get us back on course. And this idea of a course correction or some sort of a big shift in how we are approaching climate change is really the expectation this year. And that's why I think this report comes at a really key time, because what we are saying is, really reflecting to what goes on in the room around the strong discussions on equity, is that fair share really needs to be a part of this discussion, and we do want to see this reflected. It's not an easy ask of the people in the room. We're paying them to do it, but it's not an easy thing to do. But this is what we're doing with this report, is really providing our inputs to really inform on that discussion. So really the expectations going in is for the GST to come out with a roadmap here with greater specificity on concrete milestones on what we want to see to accelerate climate action. We've also heard a lot of interesting comments on this, saying, okay, well, it can't just be another report. It has to be something that really informs and really helps parties understand what the expectation is on them. And it has to really inform what they need to be thinking of as they do their NDCs. And again, that was the focus of our report here, was on the nationally determined contributions and the climate pledges. And so here it's saying, how do we inform countries on that? What are the strong signals that we can give on fair share so that countries understand how to address their current NDCs and how to think about the new NDC cycle? And I think the other thing to say is, Kelly mentioned this before, the GST is thinking about the collective assessment. And again, I think that is a challenge for fair share. It's a challenge for understanding the equity approach, because as Cece said, we really need to think about what that means across the board and give the strong signals to countries on a one-to-one basis. So really the question is, how can the Paris Agreement get us back on track? That's what the GST is here to tell us. And what we're sort of saying here is, how should it do it? Like, what is the really important things that need to be taken into consideration? And I don't know if you've been following the science this year. We've never been more informed on the scientific understanding of climate change, with the IPCC 6th assessment report, with the technical assessment phase for the Global Stocktake. And if you've been following those, you really understand that we haven't ever had this much information before on what are the barriers to emissions reduction, what are the solutions. And as Cece said, what we really need to see is more action on all fronts from all actors, and it has to happen in this critical decade, which is why the GST, the first GST, is so important. And as I said, then the question becomes, what is the role of fair share here, and can we get an understanding of this through the outcome at this COP? And this includes at all levels. So there's been discussions around, what's the expectations, for example, on a sectoral level. That's also something that we need to consider from a fair share approach. The IPCC report tells us that we need to cease all exploration of oil and gas. It tells us we need to phase out of all fossil fuels, and we need to be conserving our natural carbon sinks. And some of those are in countries that are rich, and some of those are in countries that are poor. And that's why I think this approach really needs to be taken into consideration. To talk a little bit about some of the key things that really struck me going in, because I've not much to talk about yet on the output, but there's some really interesting things that have come out of the process so far, which I think are really relevant to the fair share approach. One of these is the fact that climate impacts are eroding past human development gains. And so that has a lot of implications to how we consider fair share. And this means that we're thinking about fair share now as a snapshot, but we also need to think how it evolves. and that if we aren't going to be doing the sufficient action, the sufficient adaptation, it's going to be impeding future gains. And that comes into this whole discussion of, the links between climate and development. So how can the GST really ensure that? How can it ensure that we incorporate the science, but really make sure that we're taking an approach which is really in line with equity, and really make sure that the right signals are there for a fair share approach. The other thing that struck me was the fact that all of the solutions are there. There are cost-effective, feasible solutions, but we need to consider what cost-effective is, especially from the perspective, of different development regions, special circumstances, etc. So what does that mean? And CC indicated that, where we have countries that really need to be doing more than is possible on the current timeline, how can they help and how can they facilitate access to these technologies? Because if we take on all the technologies that have been included in the science, that will get us back on track. And so that's the shift that we need. And again, I think there needs to be more credible and accountable, transparent actions by all parties. What I've seen this year has been great. We've seen, equity really come into some of the assessments on a national level. One of the things that, I took note of this year was the science recommendations coming out of the EU and the science body there that really said, okay, this is ambition in line with the target for the EU, the 55% reduction. But what does this look like by an equity approach? So this speaks to what we want to see out of the GST, but also what we want to see next year as countries are, really considering what they want to say going forward. Yeah. And so lastly, I will finish up. In terms of the expectations, so things are moving fast, and hopefully we'll get clear signals today and tomorrow that we can really kind of engage on. But as somebody already said, I'm sorry, I don't know who, but it's about revision of our current ambition and our future ambition. So we want to see a revision of NDCs, and this is what we're providing here is our inputs on how this should look like from a fair share approach and how countries can take this on. So hopefully what we will see is countries considering this at a national level, but what we want to see this week is it being considered collectively from the GST perspective. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Shirley. Next we're going to turn to Liddy Knackbill. Cece had already referenced, but for many countries, many rich developed countries who have a high historical emissions, such as my own, the United States, their fair share is so large it all can't be done domestically. But there are also countries that have climate action potential greater than their fair share or capacity would allow them to do. So support has always been a really crucial part of the fair shares framework in underpinning how we can best move forward. So Liddy, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Kelly. Well, the first part of what I'm going to say is actually not new. It's not coming from us. It's actually based on what the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change is already saying. And that is the obligation of developed country parties to provide support or climate finance, technology transfer, and capacity building support for developing countries. And this is in recognition of the common but differentiated responsibilities, where most of the responsibility for climate change is on the part of the developed countries, of the global north, and in fact, the biggest brunt of the impacts are on the global south. So it's not new, but it's a fight that we are still fighting that is probably extremely and even harder maybe than the fight to get developed countries to reduce their emissions drastically, because they're not even acknowledging this part of the agreement. We have been met by many instances and attempts by countries to really deny this part of the climate convention. So this is not just about support for mitigation. Of course, we all know about this big fight we're having about loss and damage, where okay, we're going to have a fund, but we're not going to be sure if we're going to have adequate support or financing for the fund. This fight is very important to be seen as part of the fight on mitigation. So this is not just about greenhouse gas emissions reduction. This is about delivering the finance necessary so that reaching real zero by 2050 succeeds. And so that the very urgent actions we need to take within this decade, which will determine, as was said already, whether keeping it below 1.5 will still be a viable goal. It will be determined by what the world will do in the next few years. But the second part that I'd like to emphasize is that the situation is a lot more complex than simply acknowledging that developed countries have a bigger capacity and developing countries are impoverished. And we are going to have to deal with more than just financing mitigation. We're also financing adaptation. We're also financing loss and damage. In the meantime, that there's no adequate finance that is flowing. So the longer that the climate finance is delayed, the more we have to put up in terms of impacts and the more expensive the whole thing becomes. The more complicated part of the story is that we are actually bleeding. Every year there's at least $2 trillion of net resource transfer from the south to the north. The north should not deceive us into thinking that it's capitalizing the south. What has been happening for many decades is that the wealth transfer is from the south to the north in various forms. So we need to broaden this idea of international cooperation, and this was touched on by the CSER 2022 Equity Review Report, which we launched in Sharm el-Sheikh. The many meanings and dimensions of international cooperation includes addressing deeply embedded structural problems with the whole global economy. Starting with a few immediate things, which are also not new. They have been subjects of global movements fights. First, debt cancellation. Debt cancellation has its own reason and justice, reasons for justice. It's not for charity that we have been calling this, for this. But make no mistake, debt cancellation is not part of fulfillment of climate finance obligations. It can't be counted as that. But as long as the South is under this weight of staggering debt, most of which are debts that were generated not for the benefit of our people, but for benefits of the creditors and our global elites, we are not going to be able to do the sort of climate action that is required from us in the South, much less the additional mitigation work that we need to do, because that has to be done if we are going to succeed globally, even though it's not part of our fair share. The second thing we must address is these trade imbalances, but one of the immediate things that we want to address is this intellectual property rights regime that is preventing the technology transfer for climate action that is being talked about in the convention. This is not a new demand. It has been around for decades. In fact, it is along the lines of the similar waiver on vaccines that was raised during the time of COVID. The other thing that we must address is the international tax regime. And we're very happy to note there's already success in the UN with the adoption of resolution for the UN Convention on Tax, led by the Africa group there in the UN, in other parts of the UN processes. But there has to be a much greater political will to tax the world's elites. So there has been a big push for the wealth tax, because we can't accept this argument that there's not enough public funds for climate finance, and therefore the whole argument in the GST report, the Global Stocktake, is for us to rely primarily on global and domestic capital markets. In other words, private finance and investments. We cannot accept that. So there are many solutions. I'd like to invite you all to reread the 2022 CSER Equity Review Report, because it's several pages. I forget how many pages.
Not too many.
12 pages of very good points about international cooperation within the UNFCCC and international cooperation outside of the UNFCCC, and the broader political economy changes we need to make in the world for us to save people and planet. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Liddy. And now we're going to turn to our last speaker, Assad Riemann from War on Want. One of the things that's already been mentioned is that the countries with the biggest fair shares have been really consistently falling short of what they need to do in all of our reports and evaluations since 2015. And so Assad is going to talk about the problems with that, and particularly in the UK.
Thank you, Kelly. Listening to my colleagues, I was also thinking back to the road to Copenhagen in 2009, when I had hair and my beard was black, and rich developed countries, you know, where their goal to replace the existing climate architecture with its legally binding science-based targets, with what eventually became the Paris Agreement, and all the pledge-based architecture and the promises made. Trust us, we're committed to limiting the goal, limiting temperature level to below 1.5. Trust us, the NDCs and the GST will be a ratchet for ambition. Trust us, we're climate leaders. Trust us, we'll meet our promises on new and additional public finance, public climate finance. And of course, we're still sipping that poison chalice ever since. And way back in, as was mentioned in 2015, when we issued our first fair share report, we showed how far off developed countries were from their fair share of efforts. And of course, the last 8 years, and it's incredible 8 years of these reports, say exactly the same thing again and again. And here we see now much effort being put by developed countries to say, let's forget about the past, right? Let's not talk about the equity and our fair share of action in terms of pre-2020. And as the Secretary General said yesterday, banking on unproven and dangerous distractions like carbon markets and techno fixes. And we all know that delayed action is absolutely deadly. Look, it's not rocket science. We all know to limit temperatures to below 1.5, we do need to support a globally equitable, just transition away from fossil fuels. And we can have no more new fossil fuel extraction infrastructure. And of course, that is primarily, especially for the richest countries, such as the US, the UK, the European Union, Canada, Australia. And the need for providing climate finance. Sorry, I forgot who mentioned the IPCC report, you know, said very, very clearly the transition away from fossil fuels should not undermine social justice. Instead, social justice and equity are critical to both climate action and climate justice. And so we know that that phase out requires international support. And I'll get to my UK bit, but just building on what Lydia was saying, it was just, I mean, that breaking that cycle of debt and climate, where so many countries have to service external debt in foreign currency and then are forced into extractivism to be able to meet that, requires us not simply to be talking about end fossil fuels without understanding the need for that international support and to breaking all of these cycles, and that the rules of the international level need to be fair. Liddy said 2.2 trillion a year, that flows on unequal exchanges between the global south to the global north. When you account for lost growth in the global south, it's a whopping 152 trillion since 1960. If you take out extraction of resources and labour, just between 1990 and 2015, it's 242 trillion. It's about a quarter of all northern GDP. If you take a calculation of the overconsumption of the fair share of the carbon budget, it's been calculated by academics as being about 192 trillion. So a country like the UK would be needing to provide 4.4 trillion. 4.4 trillion, right? That puts into perspective the conversations that we're having around the paltry 100 billion that they've been unable to meet, and only a quarter of that has been new and additional finance. We know that the UK would need to quadruple its effort so far, and it was shocking to hear Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister of the UK, take to the stage 2 days ago and claim they were a climate leader, and incredibly that they were doing more to take action on climate than any other country in the world. And this is a country that has just said our pledge is to max out, and this is his quote, max out our UK's oil and gas reserves with 100 new North Sea licenses that have been given, and incredibly a new coal mine as well. And all of it claiming it's in line with the UK's net zero targets because we're investing billions in carbon capture and storage. And last year, the UK government was actually taken to court and found it illegally failed to include any policies that would be needed to deliver even this vague, unambitious, unfair emission reduction target. The High Court said you have to outline how you will meet these emissions targets. And what we've seen is fewer homes insulated last year than the year before. We've seen, and this, despite, of course, the soaring energy bills and the cost of living crisis, no progress on cutting transport emissions, an expansion of airports, no program on actually, even on behaviour change, the softest part of climate action, and all installation of new wind and solar farms is too slow to meet net zero. The Climate Change Committee, which is a legal committee formed after the Climate Change Act, said we've slipped far behind everybody else. We're not on track to meet our targets. We're not on track to meet even our short-term targets of 2030. We would need to be doubling that over the next 7 years, and of course, and that's for net zero. If we took it for a fair share, we'd be in double, if not greater, figures than that. And of course, in 2019, the UK made a commitment. It's going to double its climate finance to 11.6 billion. And again, we're far off from that. Instead, we've reduced our overseas development pledge from 0.7 to 0.5. We're now using that 0.5 to pay incredibly for UK refugee schemes, for its own domestic refugee schemes. Something no other country in the world has done is being charged against ODA money, and of course leaves us unable to even that paltry climate finance to be made available. So we know, absolutely, as my colleague said, the GST is the place we want to land this. The GST is a place where we need to operationalise equity. We need to deliver fair share NDCs. They need to be updated for 2030 and new NDCs for 2035. And that requires us to have this fair share mitigation target, which is why these reports are so important. And of course, we need a commitment to fair, fast and equitable phase-out. And that should be in every country's NDC. But we also need a commitment to the just transition that is both comprehensive and in equity. Otherwise, that is the relationship between the GST and just transition. Otherwise, we will never deliver a level of ambition, the international support, or the capacity, or the ability and the tools for developing countries to be able to do that. And of course, we must end this reliance on dangerous and distractions that we're seeing with all these false solutions that are being put there. I always like to end with those ringing words of Philip Alston, who was the UN Special Rapporteur on extreme poverty and human rights, who said, we are now entering climate apartheid scenario where the wealthy will pay to escape overheating and conflict and hunger, and they're going to leave the rest of the world to suffer. And that, of course, is already the reality at just over 1.1 degree warming. Our warning of this, why it's so important to have equity as a central part of this conversation, is because of these implications for people, for the right of people to be able to live with dignity, and for human rights and the fundamental right to life. Thank you.
Thank you so much to all of our panelists. We have 2 volunteers to run the mics if we have a second mic. So please put up your hands so we can send the mic runners in the right directions. And while people are thinking, I can also ask one question of our panelists, and this is to Assad and Liddy. Both of you were really involved in the initial 2015 report, and I am hoping to get you both to reflect a little bit on what motivated you to do that and how your thinking look now in this moment, looking back, what you think about that moment and why we're continuing to do this work. Let's start with that, and then we can go to the room.
Should I go first? Of course, for as long as we have been involved in the climate justice fight, equity has been always a central question, right? Because this is something that, first of all, parties, especially Global North parties, refuse to address, refuse to even talk about, and something where civil society groups have not really formed a very clear consensus on. So I thought this effort is really vital. And we went into this with hope, as well as, of course, with confidence that the groups that we are working with, we will arrive at very important consensus with very much with the vital support and assistance by our scientists. And it has been proven that it has been really, truly important, because now equity is being discussed in the negotiations. If we didn't do this many years ago, as we did with Taz and many others in the room, I don't think the conversations in the negotiating rooms will be in the same way. Now everybody's talking about equity. Developed country parties or the Global North parties cannot but encounter equity discussions, and they've been forced to develop arguments against our arguments on equity. So I think we've succeeded because we've been able to succeeded insofar as influencing the discourse and shaping the discourse around not just equity in fair shares and mitigation, but almost every important discussion, including, for instance, in the just transition, where equity is also a very vital concept. But of course, we have to do more, because it's not just influencing the discourse, it's actually having to make sure that equity in climate actions are actually delivered.
Just totally agree. There was a time when we were talking about equity, and I suppose it was a small number of people, a small number of civil society organizations, and a small number who said, look, equity is the key to cooperation. Equity is what unlocks ambition. You will only see that ambition when everybody knows that they're doing their fair share. And of course, it took a huge amount of work, and all the organizations on here to begin to work together and say, we'll do the research, we'll put the facts and figures, we'll put the data. This is not just some radical frame that we've got out there. It's actually rooted in reality, in science, and in data. And I think we have shifted that discourse. And as Liddy said, it's very embedded now at the international level. There is still a lot more work for us to do, particularly, I think, with Northern civil society, to be able to translate equity back into those national targets. I think too many people think equity is something we discuss in the UNFCCC, but then back domestically, pragmatism begins to shape the politics of climate targets. And that somehow the role of civil society there is to be pragmatic and push slowly, rather than actually be the truth tellers and say, this is what needs to be done. We have the solutions, and we can accelerate greater action. So still more work to be done, but I think we've made a big stride forward.
And I think it's a political pragmatism too, and not a pragmatism based on what is actually happening with the climate crisis, because that leads you to recognize equity is so essential. It'd be great to take a couple of questions. Okay, we've got those two there to start.
Hi, first off, thank you so much. I'm most excited to be at this talk of anything happening at COP, so thank you for the work, and thank you for the reports. My name is Susanna Tuttle, and I've been working as part of the U.S. Fair Share Collaborative for the past 5 years. I'm very much aligned with Kelly and the work that she does, and I'm very grateful for DCJ's support for what we're doing domestically within the U.S. And of course, Dr. Cece's work is the foundational framework for how we're able to even have the information that we do. And I say this as a faith leader. I think it's very significant, and to the point that you all have been making, and the strides that we've gotten towards around equity, and simultaneously the fact that there is the first time that there is a faith pavilion. There's been a missing voice in the negotiating space with regards to a values-based framework. And that's how I've been approaching fair shares in the US, is that it has to be the touchstone and the cornerstone for all negotiations, for every single decision that we make, that there is that fair share analysis, and that you go from there forward in every direction. And I just wanted to acknowledge, today is a very exciting day, perfect timing that this session is happening, because in the US, as people wake up over there, we have released a press release Climate Nexus is helping us push it out. Hundreds have demanded the Biden administration do its fair share for climate action at COP28. So that press release is being distributed right now. And the letter has been signed by over 50 organizations domestically and over 500 climate leaders. So I will be sure to make, the social media packet is being finished. We are doing it in domestic US time. So as soon as 9 a.m. starts, there'll be some explosions online around that. But really, really recognize over the course between now and 2025, as we go into the next round of the NDCs, want to assure all of you that internally, domestically US, we have a massive campaign around fair shares that is underway, and the education around the Fair Share NDC that was submitted to Biden as the initial request when he established the very first NDC for his administration. So that document, if you haven't had a chance to look at it, we can make sure that you have a chance to take a look at what the Fair Share NDC is for the US. It has been drafted, and we're going to break that into educational curriculum for US voting citizens, especially in 2024 during this election. So I don't have as many questions other than please tell us what we can do to support you. We are following all of your leadership, and thank you. Yes, absolutely. Thank you for the opportunity to share all of that.
Back here. The woman back, yeah.
Hi, also would like to echo a very sincere thanks from the global community for everything you all are doing. It's wonderful. I'm sorry, I'm tired already. We're not even through week one. I'm on the brink of tears already. But thank you so much. So my name is Dr. Cindy Eisenhower. I've been following the GST negotiations since Paris and the operationalization. I've coded every single party submission relative to how parties are leveraging the term equity. And I wanted, so I have a two-part question. One is, I'd love to get your interpretation of this new kind of universal language of 1.5 is the only equitable solution and it requires like universal input, right? Which to me, is important, but it's also kind of flattening any discussion of redistributive justice. And that's become the primary message from a lot of the developing countries, particularly since the subsidiary body meeting in June. The other part of the question is we're hearing a lot of questioning of the IPCC future scenarios report. So CC, I guess this is probably a question for you, particularly coming from India, Saudi Arabia, thinking about how those emission scenarios didn't take equity into account. And so I'm just wondering to what extent you feel that your work has gotten some purchase also in the IPCC space, which is being seen as the best available science, right? Because the mandate for the Stocktake was in light of equity and the best available science. So a kind of a two-part question. Interpretations of this 1.5 is the only, and so thinking about equity in terms of liberal norms of universal action versus differentiated action. And then the second part is to what extent have you gotten purchase for this work in IPCC? Thank you very much.
TC, would you like to take a crack first?
Yeah, I can say a few things to that. Well, I mean, the one thing about like 1.5 degrees, and I think you used the word flattening. I mean, it's just a matter of fact that in a 1.5 degree scenarios, there's just less space than in a 2 degrees or 5 degrees or whatever scenario, right? So it just limits the amount of like fair sharing that can be done, and so it just constrains the problem much more. So but for us, it's been always this. So for us, what I tried to highlight in the presentation in the beginning, for us, it's always been this. We have always pointed to our way of getting around this by highlighting the international cooperation part. So it seems clear to us that we cannot expect countries just to do their own thing and then the globe somehow getting to 1.5 degrees. A lot of the action has to happen in countries that cannot be fairly expected or realistically expected to pull off the additional mitigation that has to happen there in addition to their fair share. But the UNFCCC and the climate regime doesn't have a lot of like really good ways of dealing with that. They're like at least not at scale. And so, as Liddy mentioned, our report from last year is actually goes into much more detail on what kind of like things we have to do in terms of international cooperation and support, especially that actually are at the scale that would be required. And then I think you would lose this. This problem would start to diminish, I guess, if you focused more on the international support and took it into the proper account. And the other thing, I mean, around the scenarios, yeah. So we have there. I mean, the point has to be granted that most of the IEM scenarios that are summarized in IPCC reports have certain make certain assumptions and not all, and they often have equity implications and shortcomings there. We have, I guess, the way in the civil society equity review we've taken that into account is like in two ways. First of all, I mentioned already that since shortly after Paris, I guess since 2018, well, that's not so shortly, whatever, we've been using the low energy demand scenario as our mitigation benchmark. And one of the reasons is that it is one that does take equity into more proper account. It's not quite what we would like to, but it, for example, has a stronger explicit convergence of energy consumption and things like that in North and South. So it tries to make energy access for all, for example, one of its design criteria and certain other things. So that's one way. And the other way is, for example, in our fossil fuel extraction phase-out report that we're going to release tomorrow, we took this into account by not using the coal, oil, and gas phase-out timelines from the report, from the scenarios, but which are bringing down coal faster, and which is because that's mostly in developing countries. There's an equity dimension to that. So there are certain things that we've been doing to take that into account. But this is a point. But I don't know. The modeling community has to somehow deal with that, and we are not directly part of that, I guess.
I'd just like to make a comment. We're using 1.5 because we think that is still the safest level still possible. But that might not be true anymore soon. Or maybe if we examine closely some of the assumptions in the critical pathways where there's assumptions of technology, capturing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and so on, that might not even be possible anymore as we stand today. But we still want to fight for that because that is the goal that was agreed, and that is still the safest goal. When we started this fight, our goal was to keep it below 1 degree. And that's no longer possible. So we need to move the goalpost. And now pretty soon we might need to move the goalpost to another. But every time we do that, every time we move the goalpost a fraction of a degree, that means millions more lives that will be lost. So for us, it's not just a technical question, it's also a matter of a choice to be ambitious in what we're aiming for. I've heard some of the critique about the lack of equity in the scenarios, but one of the key concerns some of the scientists have who have been critiquing it is that it's not practical to expect that the climate finance will be delivered. And therefore, any scenarios we're talking about with an assumption that climate finance will not be delivered is not going to be equitable. And grant that. As long as we just accept, if we accept that climate finance will not be delivered, then any scenario will not be equitable. But we're not willing to accept. We're going to fight.
I wanted to just come in quickly in reaction to Susanna. It's great to hear what you're doing. And it maybe gives me, what I wanted to highlight is that's a very good point, that we're here this week for the next couple of weeks to really focus on what's going to come out of the GST. And when I talked about it, I talked a lot about the right signals, but actually the success of the GST is going to come out of the willingness and the ability of countries to react to what comes out of the GST. So it's very important that fair share is acknowledged in the text, but it's very important that parties are willing to follow through on it as well. So the type of work, you gave a great example, is that's the type of thing that needs to happen. It needs to also happen at the national level to engage on that. And I think that also speaks to what Liddy was saying about internally there's this equity issue which needs to be sort of understood. There's, you know, the 1% that really needs to be addressed. And then quickly, Cindy, on the IPCC, I mean, just as a general addition to what Cece said, I think certainly we've had the 6th assessment report, but we are moving into the 7th phase. And this isn't relevant for what's happening now, but I think there is a space for us to talk a little bit more with the science community, because that's what the IPCC does. It surveys what the best science is, and it collects that. And Liddy gave a really good example of how creating this narrative around equity got it into the negotiations. Can we get that narrative into the science, because it cannot be ignored? And I think that also includes in the development of the scenarios. I know that there's some people who are moving to get more Indigenous voices, for example, into the science. And I think that's a really, really important and a really helpful movement to strengthen the science as we go on. Thanks.
I've got one question here, and any other? Sorry, it's hard to see. Okay.
Sorry, I'm going to jump from handing out the mic to making one comment. And sorry, I got to go to another thing. I'm Victor Minotti with Demand Climate Justice, and also involved in the equity review. And just wanted to say, as the equity review, what we've been doing, I've been able to make DCJ interventions, but speaking as the equity review, calling for the fair shares framework to be an outcome of the GST, right? The point of the GST is to inform more ambitious and equitable NDCs, and that's what this framework does. It's the calculator that gives each country, this is our fair share and this is what we got to do. So India is calling for fair share, so they've got a different methodology. Brazil, you know, historical responsibility, but a different methodology. So it seems like we need a mandate for governments to agree on a methodology that's transparent and that will inform what future NDCs will be. I don't know if we'll get out of this, the Paris paradigm of like nationally determined, but we can at least make it now globally informed by using this framework. And I'll pass this to Carrie. Congratulations on the report.
I did want to add one question while folks think about others. Cece, actually, can you talk a little bit more about the fair share range and what the different sort of markers that we use to help define that?
Yeah, I can do that. So, remember the. Well, anyway, maybe this come back. Oh, there you go. Remember this slide that I told you I wouldn't walk through in all detail. So essentially, what we're showing here is that, especially, so first you have the common but differentiated responsibility and respective capabilities, which we take to mean responsibility for in terms of historical emissions, and capability as in like a financial wherewithal of countries. But then there's also the right to promote sustainable development, which means that countries that have large parts of populations living in poverty, lacking energy access, lacking access to affordable health care, housing, etc. Not all of their gross national income or gross national product is capacity that can be mobilized for climate action, because some of it has more pressing needs in terms of poverty eradication and those kind of things. So what we're doing in terms of calculating capacity is actually exempting parts of the incomes of, or parts of the GDP or the GNI of countries from the calculation of capacity, and we use two different, in this review, in the Civil Society Equity Review, we use two different ways of doing that. One is where we exempt all incomes below a certain, what we call the development threshold, which is set at $7,500 per person per year, but that's in 2005 dollars, so they feel kind of out of date now. And so corresponding to sort of like a decent level of living, it's much higher than just a survival threshold of like $2 a day or whatever. And so that's one of the. And then for historical responsibility, we look at how far back into the past we calculate historical emissions. So we in this report we use two different metrics for capacity, one with this $7,500 threshold, and one where we have that same threshold, but then also have a higher threshold where we recognize that even if a person is earning slightly above this threshold, they are not like rich, right? So we have a higher threshold, and between those thresholds, the income gets not fully counted, but increasingly counted. It sort of works like in most national income tax systems, there's like a lower threshold below which a person doesn't pay income tax, and then above that threshold, the income tax rate starts to increasing like gradually as a person gets more, has more income up until the point it hits a maximum rate. So it's the same sort of idea. And for responsibility, we look at, in one case, looking all at the emissions all the way back to 1850, when we first have data, and in the other case, we only go to 1950, sort of recognizing that around that time, most contemporary nation-state boundaries sort of settled, and the great acceleration, as it's sometimes called, got underway, and most of the infrastructure that was created since that time is still benefiting people today, and so there's a different level of responsibility coming from that. So those are the different settings that we use to define the ends of our equity range for this work.
Thank you. Do we have any last questions? Okay, in that case, I'm going to turn to our panelists for some quick closing thoughts.
And I just want to say how important that point that Cici was saying about the threshold of 7,500, that we moved the needle on the survival $2 a day or what, $1.90 of the World Bank, and actually are centering the right to be able to live with dignity, right? That's our goal for everyone. And I think this is where the equity frame is not simply a technical frame that talks about carbon. Actually, it's a lens in which we begin to look at the world, and we look at the world we want to create. And so, and it's a useful tool, and hats off to all the comrades in the US who have been taking that and then applying what that fair share would look like, because I think that's exactly what needs to be happening in all rich developed countries. What is that fair share? Because this is not just about equity between societies, the global north, it's equity within societies as well. We also probably saw the Oxfam report that said the richest 1% produce more carbon than the poorest 66%, who would have to pollute for what I think was 1,500 years before they would make the same amount of carbon as a millionaire makes each year. But when we tie that along with the fact that that same 1% has taken in the last decade a half of all global wealth, and in the last 2 years twice the wealth of the rest of the 99%, then the politically what sounds impossible to meet the goal of 1.5 actually becomes realistic when we start talking about wealth taxes, right? Oxfam says 5% will give you 1.7 trillion. I have to say, as a climate justice person, I say eat the billionaires, and we should be asking, why do we have billionaires in the first place? Why do we have billionaires in the first place? We should not be talking, if we want to talk about wealth, you know, it's not just about taxing them at a rate of 5%. I say tax them out of existence, right? So there's no lack of resources. It's a political will. And political will is important for us because we're faced with a challenge also of not just climate denialism, but of people weaponizing climate, of walls, fences, ethno nationalism. We see the rise of the right across Europe because they're talking about inequality and using inequality to stop climate action. And our way forward is to talk about equality and justice as a driver for the climate ambition. That's why these equity reports shouldn't be just read, you know, for here in the UNFCCC. They should be shaping our politics as climate justice groups in all of our spaces.
Phil, you've put me after somebody really good again, but I think that's just the problem of being on this panel. Maybe not as inspiring, but a bit more practical. I just want to echo, you know, some of the points before that this week is very important to lay the groundwork for this critical decade. And if we don't have the shift that we need, then, you know, we're really going to be struggling. And I talked a little bit about how this was an opportunity and a challenge, and that was my main message. And I think that's something to keep in mind. It's a challenge for the people we pay, challenge for the people in the room, but it's an opportunity to get it right. And so at the moment, I mean, we're still sort of fairly near the beginning. I'm feeling very optimistic, and I'm really hoping I come out of COP28 with that, ready to really make those challenges. But yeah, let's see. And I think overall, if we do want to see the rapid change, then we do need to have this fair share approach. I think that underpins this idea of rapid change, rapid, you know, reduction of emissions. If we want to address the climate anxiety, this is what we need to be addressing. So I think that's maybe just a summary of why it's important to me personally. Thanks.
Two things which is very important for Southern people's movements. We need empowering approaches, and this is an empowering approach. This tells us we are not begging, we are not looking for your help, we are not asking for charity. This is what we are entitled to. And that is very important in building movements. So it's good that we are saying this not only out of principle, but because it's based on science and because it's also a politically practical requirement, because this is not going to succeed without equity. And then just the second point, I want to advertise tomorrow. There will be a launching of equity in the phase out of fossil fuel extraction at 9:30 at the CSO Hub. It's going to be presented also by the same network, but it's another report that complements this one. So I hope we see all of you there, 9:30.
You took I wanted to do the plug.
Advertise.
So I don't have anything to add because Liddy already said that we want to. So, but the report launched tomorrow. It's it will be interesting. We have phase out dates for countries when they have to stop the extraction of fossil fuels. So that's interesting and helpful.
Well, I want to thank all of our panelists for your presentations today. Please do look at the equity deficit report and the fossil fuel phase-out report, both of which can be found, the equity report as of today can be found at the Civil Society Equity Review website, which is equityreview.org. We'll all be available outside if you also want to ask questions and are feeling less shy without microphones. But thank you again for coming to really think about equity and how essential it is for the climate action we need. Thank you.